worked last time, so it will hopefully work for this one because I'm in a bit of a different environment.
What For sure. What I have suggested to my reporters before is you can maybe try and use your phone microphone as well, like as a backup, just in case it doesn't work on here. But as you're saying, if you're in a busy environment, it might not work very well.
Yeah, I think I've got my computer recording and the screen recorder, so it should hopefully work. I have a list of questions here, so if you don't mind, I'll just start off right away.
Good stuff.
Okay, so like since 2008, we had like the Great Recession after like a bunch of stuff, and like after that, Britain's kind of productivity growth has never really recovered, and we've saw like problems like stagnant wages and like really low GDP growth, and there's like a lot of solutions put forward, but none have really like kind of fixed the issue, especially after COVID. It's kind of gotten worse. Like right now, our productivity growth is kind of worse than during the Depression, which is a bit sad. Do you think is there any like good solution given like the state of the economy now and like state of like how Parliament is going to pass things and like how like the government could hopefully be able to like kind of fix this economical issue, like realistically?
Realistically, I think what the UK needs would be investment, and that would be both public investment and some private investment as well. I think you can trace back a huge portion of the lack of productivity, the lack of growth to the Conservative government's austerity agenda. So, of course, you had the crash in 2008, and then in 2010, the Conservatives came to power, supported by the Liberal Democrats, and their style of government was to cut public services to the bone, very deliberately, stop public spending. Their argument was that would save money, it would improve the situation with public debt, and therefore it would solve the problems with the economy. Now, it was very clear very quickly that just cutting does not actually fix your economic problems. It causes significant long-term economic problems in the process, but they continued to do it. And so while they may have saved money at the time, what they have done is created much bigger problems. For example, in the mentioned COVID, the NHS was in a terrible place going into the pandemic because it had already been cut so much from what it was at previously, and it was failing to meet targets for treatment and things, and there's not enough staff working there, and that just causes further problems because more people get sick, more people become economically inactive, and the sort of cycle just continues. So I would also argue that failing to invest properly in infrastructure, look at HS2 as a great example. We were supposed to have this amazing high-speed rail going from London up to the north of England. And when more people can travel across the UK more easily, more freely, more affordably, they spend their money in different places and it helps the economy. So you might save money by cutting back on HS2 and not doing it the way that you planned to do it originally. But in the long term, how much money are you losing because those people aren't traveling around spending money, earning money in different places? So my argument would be austerity is to blame, with Brexit also on the side to blame in more recent years. And to address that, we would have to invest properly in the UK. But I don't think either main party, the Conservatives or Labour, are very interested in doing that. I mean, we're speaking just a day after Labour announced that they would be scrapping their £28 billion green investment pledge, which is really disappointing because it was their only major investment pledge, and now they don't have any amount of money really put aside to invest in the UK, which is what it needs, and that's what a lot of economists are arguing that it needs. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I hope that
no, that's amazing.
established it.
Yeah. Do you think that's because of Britain's like style of like re-elections every 5 years kind of prohibits the government from making like long-term decisions? Like you see how like China's government or something like America, because they're kind of sure that they're going to stay in power for a while, they're able to enact these like 20-year or 50-year plans that allow them to make like really great high-speed railways. Or is that something that Britain has an advantage in, or probably like this will draw back our ability to kind of like invest in the country?
Oh, sorry, one second. I stole someone's office and now they're back. I'm just going to find a different office. One second. Sorry about that.
Oh,
Yeah,
no.
I thought they were free until 4, but I realized the time has kind of me. Yes. So you were saying, is that an advantage or a disadvantage? I would argue it's a huge disadvantage. Ultimately, it's a good thing to have democratic participation on a regular basis. And 5 years is a long time in politics, and people deserve to have their say at the ballot box again. Really, what the core of the problem is the two-party system, where first past the post forces us to vote for, well, most people in the UK, and in Scotland, the SNP are in as well, but there will obviously never form a UK government. The first past the post system forces us to choose between a Labour government and a Conservative government, and there's always this underlying feeling that it's just going to keep switching back between the two of them, and nobody really wants to make long-term decisions because it might just get eradicated by the next government coming into place. And also because they have a fear that the public don't like big spending pledges. So this is exactly why Labour just abandoned that 28 billion investment pledge yesterday, because they are concerned that the public will say, well, that's a lot of money to spend today, and we aren't going to see the results immediately. It's also why the UK government never really properly invested in nuclear energy. Now, nuclear energy could have potentially been a really significant part of the UK's energy mix, and it would stop us from being reliant on oil and gas so much. I know it's a very controversial type of energy, but let's say if we had invested in nuclear in 2010, 2011, as we had initially talked about doing, we would have had more nuclear energy plants up and running now, like today, when we have a cost of living crisis. It would have been very helpful to have that. But the Lib Dems ruled it out back 10 plus years ago because they felt like there weren't any short term benefits. Now it's easy to look back in 2024 and say, well, it would have actually been very useful for you to think about those long-term benefits. But that's not how politics works in the UK. I would argue that it is a major issue because not thinking 5 years, 10 years ahead, it means that we're not dealing with impending crises that are coming our way. Climate change is going to cause major issues for infrastructure. Right now would be a good time to look at the train infrastructure, for example, which is already having major problems every time there's a storm. Storms are more frequent. So if we don't deal with that now, it's only going to get worse, and then there are consequences for it. Again, that was a long answer, but I hope it's
Yeah,
helpful.
no, that's amazing. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think I'm gonna move on to another topic about like kind of like the effects of that was like regional inequality, which is like a really hot topic in Britain and like in Scotland. Like there's a thing that we always say that how like Scotland's a lot poorer than like down there in England. But if we look at like the charts and everything, England's not richer than Scotland if we take apart London, and like London is where like most, if not all, of the wealth in the country is like kind of congregated. So do you think this kind of high reliance on London with all its like, financial output or like all its like money generation and like this is kind of like ruining how like the country would have like problems right now, or it might pose like bigger problems in the future? Like that's how the country's been for a while, but since like we're in this stage of like economic instability, with that kind of like over reliance on London would be kind of a big problem after, because after Brexit, like a lot of companies are leaving London right now for other places like Paris. So would that pose like much bigger of a problem?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's never a good idea to have all of your wealth for the country situated in one geographic location, but also in one sector. So, if we're hoping that all of our money comes in through the financial services sector, and then let's say we have another situation like 2008 and there's big problems in the financial services sector, then what are we going to do? And it's also quite unfair because obviously a huge amount of the money that the UK government brings in is through oil and gas in the North Sea, and that's obviously up north in Aberdeen. And it's a lot of workers from Aberdeen and from the north of Scotland who go and work on those offshore oil rigs. And the money that is produced from there is not necessarily seen in those northern and more rural parts of Scotland. It goes straight to London, which means the places responsible for the creation of wealth are not necessarily seeing the wealth that they are creating. And I think that is a huge political issue as well, because people in Scotland who are suffering from fuel poverty, for instance, can see that there's a huge amount of money being made by the oil companies, the fossil fuel firms, and they're struggling to put their own heating on. So that is a political issue, it is a humanitarian issue, and it is also a geographical issue. Regional inequality is never productive because it only leads to depopulation. And that's what happens in a lot of areas. A lot of more people leave. You end up with a skewed, much older population, and then the economic activity is only going to decrease from there.
Yeah, thank you. That actually kind of makes sense in a lot of ways. I wasn't aware that like most of our money was made kind of up here, which is really surprising since I thought UK was for like trading and like stock markety. I think in a similar way, like another large city in like the UK is like Birmingham in both like GBA and like employee productivity, but it's like halfway behind London and like one fourth of the way behind London's most richest sectors. But do you think the UK would be able to foster another city like right now as much output as London, or is that kind of like not able to do because of how we've ran for so many years?
It could do it. It could do it. It would take political will. And that's the thing is if everyone who's making the big decisions are based in London, then of course it's in their personal and often financial interest to maintain London as that place. And also there was a bit of a push about a year and a half ago from the Chancellor to there was something called the like Edinburgh Agreement, which was designed to boost the financial services sector in Edinburgh as well. But that hasn't really gone anywhere. And I think a lot of people in Scotland wouldn't really want our economy to be completely reliant on the financial services sector because we've seen what that can do to not just this economy, but a lot of Western economies since the financial crash of 2008.
Yeah, that seems like yeah. Well, if we were to like break apart instead on relying on like all these like English like kind of decisions for like Scotland and like kind of gain this like financial independence, do you think like Edinburgh would be able to fill that part of like how London is for like, the UK as that for Scotland and would like that have like a good reception, or would it be like too much of a harsh change from how like Edinburgh's kind of functioning right now?
Well, I don't. It depends how you define supporting the rest of the UK from what London's doing right now, because we're both discussing that London takes in a huge proportion of the wealth, but does that mean that the rest of England actually benefits from that? And does it mean that the UK actually benefits from it? And if you measure it purely through GDP, then perhaps it looks like the UK is a wealthy country thanks to London, but how much wealth is reinvested and how much of it actually goes to communities that need it more. So I don't know. It depends on what you mean exactly by supporting the rest of the UK. But
Mm,
Scotland has a huge amount of resources. Its natural resources, particularly in the renewables industry, would be a massive, a huge benefit to it if we were to become independent, and would certainly make more than enough money to support us. There would have to be changes in our economy, that's absolutely certain, but I don't concern myself too much about whether Edinburgh would be able to replicate the City of London because the City of London has had corrupt Russian money flowing through it for the past several decades and various other things that probably weren't very beneficial to the people of the UK.
Yeah, okay. That was quite an interesting thing that I looked into too about like how London is kind of like the gathering place of a lot of corruption and money. And it's kind of quite interesting how
Mm.
like they kind of all gather in London simply because of London's like high status but kind of like falling-ish, and it's better for them to have a lower cover. Um, well, let's talk Scotland then. Do you think Glasgow with like there was an article that I read, I think, which ranked Glasgow like as higher than Edinburgh as like a city to be a tourist in. But do you think Glasgow has a chance against Edinburgh in like both like think output or like productivity, or as in like kind of our own little industries as like a chance against Edinburgh to become again like one of the big powerhouses of Scotland?
It certainly could, and again, it's a matter of political will. Glasgow was once a hub for the industrial sector. We're building ships, we're building all kinds of things. Those days are gone. What we haven't really been able to establish is a new version of what our big money maker is here in Glasgow. So I do think that it's entirely possible. There would have to be big changes in Glasgow. Right now, oops, sorry, I'm getting a call. I will just cancel that. Yeah, right now in Glasgow, we're too reliant on the private sector. We're too reliant on businesses coming into a city centre and saying, okay, we are going to invest here. There needs to be a bit of innovation and a bit of creativity to bring money into the city. But I certainly believe that it could be a very attractive place for both people coming from abroad and people coming from the rest of the UK to settle down. There's so much going on here historically, culturally. We just have to probably think about the wealth creation in the city and think about how better to promote ourselves as well.
Mhm. Then what do you think, in your opinion, is like a good industry or a good area for like Glasgow to kind of invest into?
I know that there's a lot of talk about financial, like technology services, so fintech is what they would call it, and life sciences are also a really good earner and interesting sort of sector for Glasgow as well. So
Yeah.
those are areas that would be good to see a little bit more investment into, certainly.
Yeah. There's also like people saying that Glasgow is kind of dependent on how the university draws in a bunch of like foreign students. Do you think that's kind of a main thing in Glasgow, and does that affect any of the things if we were to kind of not fund as much international students or like primarily draw in international students?
That's really interesting. So I think it's not just Glasgow that's affected by that. I think it's Edinburgh as well on quite a big scale. I think both cities are quite attractive for people coming from abroad, just given the history of the big universities and their success on the league tables and things. But also St Andrews. I mean, if you look at the East Coast, it's a huge portion of foreign students in St Andrews as well. It's, with the way that the university funding model works right now, there is obviously a need for a sizable amount of international students to come because they pay fees. So the Scottish-based students, they aren't the ones paying for fees; they get them for free, and so there is a need to make up the money to fund the universities elsewhere. I don't necessarily think that's like a bad system. Personally, I am in favor of universal access to education, especially.
Sorry, you're kind of frozen right now. I think my Wi-Fi's gone a bit wrong.
Further education. I think it gives a lot of people a lot of opportunities. What would change that? I believe if we were an independent country, we would have other means of making money, and therefore we wouldn't have to worry so much about that. But I think having international students in Scotland is a wonderful thing. They bring a lot to the cities that they come to stay in. They share knowledge. What I think we should do is focus on trying to get more of them to stay here after they finish their degrees to come to Scotland and become part of Scotland, because especially after Brexit, depopulation is quite a big concern to those of us living here.
Yeah, that's thank you. So speaking of Brexit, do you think like the UK would kind of be able to undo a lot of its like losses during Brexit? Like think like the cost of living crisis and like a lot of layoffs due to that. Do you think if like the UK were to engage in more trade with Europe, or would we even be able to hypothetically rejoin the EU, as most Britons right now are very pro joining the EU? Do you think that'd be plausible? And if not, are there any like kind of backdoors that the UK could do to kind of undo the damage done by Brexit?
That's a tough one. I think that to undo the damage, we would have to completely rejoin the EU, like definitely full membership. Right now, there is minimal interest from the current UK government in maintaining a good relationship with the EU. So I don't know if you've kept up with this at all, but there's a new, well, it's not that new, but new legislation went through last year called the Minimum Service Guarantee. So, under this law, striking workers, especially in the transport industry, also in emergency services, I believe, they cannot go on a full strike. They have to operate using a minimum service. So, say all of them want to go on strike because they're not getting a good enough pay rise, they aren't allowed to do that because they have to provide a minimum amount of service to, and otherwise they'll basically be sanctioned by the government, etc. So it's come out this week that this is effectively of the EU and the UK's withdrawal agreement. So we could have just jeopardized our entire trading agreement with the EU as a result of that legislation. So if the UK was really concerned about wanting a better relationship with the EU, helping its economy, I don't think it would be doing things like that. I also can see the divergence between the UK government and the EU is just increasing all the time. So the EU is quite big on human rights and things. And this week it looks like the UK government wants to ban people from wearing masks at protests. So I can't imagine that will go down particularly well either. In the future, UK government probably will be a Labour one, but I don't think Labour want to rejoin the EU. I don't think that would be a politically sensible decision for them to make. To be honest, people voted for Brexit, unfortunately, and I don't think it would be a good idea to revert on it. I think a lot of people in England, especially who did support Leave, want to see Brexit kind of made to work for them rather than undone altogether. So Keir Starmer is not going to take us back into the EU. So the only option for Scotland really is to become an independent country and join the EU ourselves. But that's obviously a very long term kind of project, at least 5 years to 10 years from the time that if we vote for independence.
Yeah. Do you think there's like, speaking of like the EU and Scotland, is there like a guarantee that Scotland would be able to join the EU? Or is there like a chance that even if we gain independence, the EU won't kind of take us back in a kind of way?
I don't think that there's any reason to think that they would stop us from joining. I know a few years ago people used to talk about Spain possibly vetoing us because of the Catalonia situation, because Catalonia obviously wanted to become an independent country. Spain was very opposed to that. They didn't want to see that Scotland was setting a bad example for them. But Spain have basically said now, listen, we wouldn't stop you if it was a democratic vote. And I know there's a bit of a misconception that there's sort of a queue of countries waiting to join the EU. It doesn't quite work like that. It's not like in a shop, you're not all lining up waiting to get in. Different claims are kind of assessed at different times. So, for example, Ukraine is kind of going through the motions of trying to get into the EU, but that's more likely to take quite a significant amount of time to really happen because obviously they're at war, so that would make them kind of a less desirable member for the EU in a sense, and in another sense, it makes them more desirable because you would want to protect them, right? But it makes it more complicated. Meanwhile, Scotland has already been a member of the EU. It's got a government pretty committed to trying to maintain a similar path to the EU. We're making sure that our laws and our legislation doesn't diverge too much from EU laws and legislation. we're focused on maintaining our good links. We have a Scottish government presence in Brussels. We're looking at getting a Scottish government presence in other cities in Europe. The biggest issue would be the currency one. So there would be pressure from the EU to join the euro. I don't think anyone in Scotland is particularly keen for that. But there's confusion in general over where Scotland's currency would go. Would we keep the pound? That's opposed by a lot of people. Would we have our own currency? The EU wouldn't like that if we were just starting our own currency. That would be the biggest issue. But obviously, if people want to work around that, they will work around that. Otherwise, Scotland would be a very desirable country for the EU, and a lot of European politicians have said so.
Well, that seems quite good for Scotland, as we've seen. Um, Yeah, so last question. Thank you very much for joining me today. One thing that a lot of like pro Scotland independent people have talked about is that like if we join the EU, not only would we gain like financial independence from like England, we'd be able to like trade with the EU, and that would help us quite a bit. But as we can see currently, like 70% of Scotland's export, import, all that kind of stuff is from England. And if we gain independence, would there be a chance of us losing England, and would that kind of be very detrimental to the Scottish economy?
But I would argue to look at Ireland. So Ireland is just across the sea, and they share a border with the rest of the UK, just like Scotland would after if it became independent. We would have a border with England. Ireland maintains very strong trade links with Northern Ireland. We are in the common travel area with Ireland, so that makes kind of it's in the EU, we're not, it's a different country to us. I don't see any reason why Scotland shouldn't have a similar situation to that of Ireland. Uh, Ireland has also massively improved its trading. They went off to be by itself and do something outside of the EU. You know, they've set up ferry links and shipping links with the rest of Europe, and it seems like they've got more standing in the European Parliament as well. So I think that they show what Scotland could potentially do, and Ireland's economy is growing faster than the UK's. So it's not too much of a concern.
That seems like quite a positive note to end this off. I'm so glad that you're able to like kind of have this interview with me, and I'm really, really glad for your opinions. And yeah, I hope this will turn out well. I think if the article is going to be published, I'll send a copy to you so you can look over it and think that it's alright. But thank you very, very much.
Definitely, I would love that. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful that you asked me. And if you think of anything else that you want to ask me about, just drop me a message. You've got my email address. So good luck
Yes, thank you very
with
much.
the piece.
Thank you. Well, I'll let you get on with
Thanks so
your
much. Have a
and
good day.
have a good day. Oh my God, that was stressful. So very